Hey everyone, it's Lars here, and welcome back to Virtual Paddock. Today is the 12th of September 2023, and for some car enthusiasts it's a pretty special day, because exactly 60 years ago, a legendary sports car was presented to the public at the 1963 Frankfurt Motor Show. I'm talking of course about my favorite car, the Porsche 911. And to celebrate this anniversary, I've decided to do a video series about the history of the 911. I've picked out several significant models from its history to drive and sim. Starting today with the origins of the 911 and its first generation. Now first, let's look at what happened before the 911. Ferdinand Porsche was a well-known engineer who had for example designed the Volkswagen Beetle. But it wasn't until 1948 that the name Porsche became its own road car brand, with this car, the 356, designed by Ferdinand's son, Ferry Porsche. And the 356 was a lightweight and nimble sports car, powered by a naturally aspirated flat 4, ranging from a 1.1 litre 40 horsepower up to a 2 litre 130 horsepower engine, though this was over 4 different generations. Originally simply called the 356, then from 1955 onwards 356A, followed by 356B in 1959, and finally the 356C from 1963. However, by the late 50s, Porsche noticed that there wasn't much left to develop for the 356, especially when it came to the engine. So they started working on a replacement, and now it was Ferry's son, Ferdinand Alexander Porsche, by the way was also known as Butzi. It was him who ended up designing the new car. So at the 1963 Frankfurt Motor Show, on the 12th of September, Porsche presented this, the 901. Powered by a 2 litre air-cooled flat 6 in the rear, producing 130 horsepower. And let's take it for a drive. Alright, so here I am in the Porsche 901. So yeah, the very first 911s weren't actually badged as 911. Though the 901 is very rare. I think they only made like 82 of these. And the reason for the name change was that very shortly after they started producing these, in September of 1964, like a month in, Peugeot protested. Because it turned out that in France, Peugeot actually had exclusive rights to name a car a 3-digit number with a 0 in the middle. So this solved the problem when Porsche in early 1965 simply raised the middle digit by 1 and thus gave us the 911. It's been called the 911 ever since. So first 911s were identical to the 901. Same engine, same layout, same everything. Another very interesting thing about the 901 and the very early 911 is that while it's typically considered the replacement, the successor to 356, you could argue that technically that's not quite true. Because, as I mentioned, they started making these in late 1964, but the 356C was actually made until March of 1965, so for around half a year. They actually produced both alongside each other, with obviously the 911 being the more expensive model. But Porsche still wants to have an entry-level model after they discontinued the 356. And what they did was simply took the 911, gave it a bit more of a basic interior with, I think, just 3 instruments instead of the 5 that you see here. And gave it a 4-cylinder 1.6 liter flat 4 with 90 horsepower instead of the 2 liter flat 6 that's in this one, and called it the 912. And the 912, interestingly enough, actually outsold the 911 at first. Partly, of course, because it was cheaper, but also it was easier to drive, because the engine wasn't as big, wasn't as heavy, so you had less weight out there at the back. It had better weight distribution. And that brings up an important point about the 911, because the way this handles it, I guess you could say it handles like you would expect from a sports car, a rear-engine sports car, where they haven't quite figured out all the quirks of the rear engine yet. So let me see if I can find a turn to demonstrate it. Turn in, lift off, and lift it oversteer. And throughout the history of the 911, Porsche did a few things to tackle this. One of the first was to lengthen the wheelbase, which they did in, I don't know exactly which year, it was in the late 60s. Even at the same time, they did give it a heavier engine. A few years in, they first increased the engine size to 2.2 liters, and then later to, they call it 2.4, but it was, strictly speaking, was 2,341 cc, which actually correctly is rounded to 2.3. But I come back to the handling and trying to combat some of the inherent problems of the rear engine. For the 1972 model year, Porsche decided to move the oil tank from behind the engine to in front of the engine. And in order to access the oil tank, they put a flap at the front of the rear fender. And you can probably see where this is going, because that flap was exactly where on most cars you'd have the flap for the fuel tank. And some people ended up putting fuel there where actually oil is supposed to go, and that resulted in quite a few engine failures. And so those models are in German simply known as the Ölklappenmodelle. So oil flap or oil door models. But then Porsche realized it was a bad idea. They discontinued those after just 1 year. Still, these early 911s, they laid the groundwork for the definition of what a 911 is. And while they've refined it over the years, they, in a way, it's stayed the same. It's still the same basic shape. Still got a rear engine. Still got flat six. It's a car that I absolutely love. And this is the one where it all started. The 901. Now, given that Porsche is a sports car brand, motorsport has always been a big part of its identity. And you can even see that in the badges. The Targa is named after the Targa Florio, and the Carrera badge came from the Carrera Panamericana. And speaking of Carrera, in 1972 we got the first 911 to carry that badge, the now legendary 911 Carrera RS 2.7, with a 2.7 liter flat six and 210 horsepower. And this one's easily recognizable by its rear spoiler, the ducktail, or as it's called in the Swabian dialect, Entenbürzel. So let's take this one on the drive as well. Right, so now driving the Carrera RS 2.7. And I decided to take this one to a racetrack, in this case Silverstone, because this car isn't only connected to motorsports through its name, the Carrera name, but also because it was actually designed as a homologation model. And Porsche had originally only intended to make around 500 of these, but it ended up being so popular that in the end they made like 1,590, I think. So more than 3 times what they originally intended. And I'm actually in the less common version right now, because Porsche offered 2 versions. There was one called the Touring, which was a bit more road oriented, a bit more comfort oriented, and that was by far the most common one. Most customers went for the Touring version. But I'm driving the Sport version right now. It was a bit more stripped out, it was a bit lighter. There's a bit more track focused, performance focused. And you can just tell that at this point Porsche already had a good amount of experience with the 911. It just handles so much better than the 901. But still it does have the 911 quirks. It's easy to make it oversteer. By simply going into a corner with a bit too much momentum. The rear end wants to come round. But this one feels lovely to drive. You see there, I gave it a bit of throttle, lifted off. Still got some lift over oversteer, but very controllable. through these fast corners. It's too heavy at the back and wants to understeer. Which is another very much classic 911 quirk. You understeer at high speeds. Now these are obviously also very highly valued and very popular among enthusiasts. In fact, some even consider this to be the best classic 911. In my opinion, it's a very worthy send-off for the first generation of the 911, because this being the 1973 model year, that was the last model year of the first generation of 911, and bigger changes were to come. And I'm not actually sure, but this might also be the first time Porsche used the RS badge on the road cars. Certainly the first 911 with the RS name, which now denominates the very sporty 911s. So fantastic car. Now the Carrera RS 2.7 was in fact so popular that the engine was even made available going into the next generation of the 911. But I'll be telling you more about that in part 2. And for now, I just want to say thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. So, till next time, use the downforce, and see you soon.